So as John has already mentioned, we have the Summer Connect events ready for you to sign up for. If you go back there and you're like, boy, I'm not really interested in any of these Summer Connect events, maybe you've got an idea that you want to volunteer. We would love to hear about that, potentially make it a church event. I was actually thinking about some potential Summer Connect ideas. I was actually thinking it would be really fun here at the church to have sort of our own version of like a UFC fight, you know, like Ultimate Fighting Challenge. And like anybody who wanted to participate could be a part of this, and then if you didn't want to be a part of it, because I thought we could have like a ring downstairs. Wouldn't that be sweet? Do you think we could set that up, Alex? And then if you didn't want to participate, then we could place bets on the contestants, right? Who's going to win, right? So I can already tell you that my wife is going to want to be in that competition. I'm telling you what. And I'll fight too. And I'd just be kind of curious, like if we were to bet here between if my wife and I were to fight UFC challenge. Right? I mean, who do y'all think would win? Yeah, right? Probably Laura. Actually, I'll never forget one time she went to a Krav Maga class. You guys know what Krav Maga is? It's like this Israeli street fighting thing, hand fighting, whatever, I don't know. And so she goes to this Krav Maga class. A friend of her invited her to this class. And she comes home, and literally the first thing she says when she walks in the door is she says, "Quick, put me in a headlock." And I did, and the next 2 minutes were some of the most uncomfortable 2 minutes of my life. Today we are continuing in our series called Different. This is a series on the book of 1 Peter. We launched this on Easter Sunday, which is now about 6 weeks ago. And we launched it on Easter Sunday because this entire series is centered on the reality of Easter. That because of the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and through our faith in the death and the resurrection of Jesus, it enables us to be different, to live differently, right? We talk about how Steph Curry and Caitlin Clark are different on the basketball court. You see them and they're just different. Well, the idea here is that empowered by the death and resurrection of Jesus, we are empowered to be different on the court of life. And so what we're doing is we're just exploring, as we go through the book of 1 Peter, which explores this theme, helps us to see what does it look like. We've been exploring these different ways, called and indeed empowered to be different. And today, we see the whole concept of marriage and how Christians are empowered and called to live in a way in their marriages which are very different from what you will often find in the world at large. And so we're going to explore that here, but I need to, as we come into this passage, I need once again to just briefly place it within its broader context, historical, literary context. Before we get into the passage, I did this a lot last week. This passage we're looking at today is somewhat of a continuation of what we saw last week. And last week I went to great extent to explain how if you read this passage in this section in 1 Peter, and you don't take into account the historical context, you'll actually often get the opposite message from the passage than it's actually communicating. You might think on the surface that this passage and what comes before it shows that the early church was very much in favor of the oppression of women, very patriarchal. It sort of was in favor of the institution of slavery and all this. And I went into great detail last week to show that actually when you set this against its historical backdrop, you discover the very opposite. That the early church actually sought to elevate the place of slaves and women in a very patriarchal society. That the Roman Empire, which is the society in which the people to whom this letter was written, they lived, was a very patriarchal society. So we explored that. Set against that backdrop, we see that the early church, and indeed even this letter, helps to elevate the place of the slave and women within broader society. And actually, we talked about this last week. We see it again in the beginning of this passage. Just the fact that Peter addresses wives in the letter. It says wives, right? Actually talks to them. Right? In a letter of this kind in the Roman society, usually you wouldn't even bother addressing the wives. Same thing with the slaves. He actually addresses the slaves. And generally speaking, that would have sort of been beneath a Roman writer to even waste their pen including them in the address. But it goes even farther than that. Look at this here in verse 7. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Now, here, when Peter refers to the woman as the weaker vessel, he is more than likely commenting on the fact that, generally speaking, men are physically stronger than women. Now, we know that that's not always true. As you all just demonstrated by saying that you would pick my wife in a UFC fight between me and her, right? So that's not always true. Men aren't always stronger, but generally they are. And certainly in the patriarchal society of the Roman Empire, where we explored last week that domestic abuse was illegal, but that doesn't mean it wasn't widespread. So he may have even have that in mind as he addresses husbands in this fashion. Okay, but set against this cultural backdrop, two things really stand out about what Peter says in that verse. In particular, he says for the husbands to honor their wives. Just that, okay, is shocking when you look at ancient Roman literature. Honor your wives. The word that is used there for honor, interestingly enough, is a word that elsewhere in the New Testament is often used to refer to honoring God. So in 1 Timothy, the Apostle Paul writes to his disciple Timothy, and he uses this word. He says, "To the King of the ages, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen." And there, the word honor is the word time, the Greek word time. Actually, I think it's interesting. He's writing this letter to Timothy, and the name Timothy literally means the one who honors God. It's the combination of this Greek word time and then theos, which is the Greek word for God, means to honor God. And so he uses this word time in this letter to Timothy. But then this same word is used of Peter, but not in reference to honoring God, but in reference to honoring their wife. Right, this was truly unprecedented in Roman literature. And then it goes on to say that they are co-heirs. Husbands, your wives are co-heirs with you in the inheritance. That's shocking because, generally speaking, in the Roman Empire, women, they didn't own property most of the time. Usually they had to be under the authority of either their father or a brother or a husband for property rights and whatnot. And so here he's saying, no, in God's economy, in the age to come, you are co-heirs. You are equal in the kingdom of God. So even in this letter, which on first reading might lead you to believe that it's encouraging the oppression of women, set against the historical backdrop of the Roman Empire, we see exactly the very opposite. Now, the question, of course, still remains, and this is a question which we looked at last week, but we'll address it again, is then why does Peter tell the wives to submit to their husbands? And we saw last week that there's a very practical reason that is specific to what they were dealing with, and that was essentially what Peter is saying to the wives is, hey, listen, don't rock the boat, right? We talked about how it seems that what was going on is that in the early church, women were flocking to the church. Women were converting to Christianity and joining the church. We talked about how the sex ratios in the church, there were way more women proportionally than there were in the Roman Empire, because all these women converting to Christianity, they're coming to faith, their husbands aren't. So you have a bunch of Christian women married to pagan husbands. These Christian women are coming to church, and they're hearing about the love of Jesus. They're hearing about the equality and the dignity that they have in the eyes of God that they're not, quite frankly, getting at home, and they're not getting in the broader society. And so you can imagine many of them are kind of like, they're tempted to go back and start, flaunting this newfound freedom. And they're already pushing things because in the Roman Empire, a woman was expected to worship the same gods as her husband. So it's already suspect that she's leaving her husband to go to church and worship with these strange Christians. They're already pushing the limits a little bit. So I think just from a pastoral standpoint, Peter's saying, hey, look, Rome wasn't built in a day, and it's not going to be undone in a day. The patriarchalism of the Roman world is not going to be undone in a day So don't rock the boat. So we saw that very practical reason, but then we also saw that there's a deeper theological reason for why he encourages them to submit themselves to their husbands. And what we saw last week, and the same goes for the slave or whatever position you're in, was simply this idea that we are all called to be mediators of the presence of God. Right? That was actually the central theme of one of the messages a few weeks ago, when we looked earlier in the letter, where he says that this is our different purpose. We talk about what is different about the Christian community, and one of the things that is different is we have this incredible calling to be the mediators of the presence of God. That whatever station you are in life, whether you are a wife or a husband, whether you are in their context a slave or a slave owner, in our context if you're an employer or an employee, whatever situation you're in, you're called to mediate the presence of God, which means that you love people the way Jesus loved people, which means that you live as a servant. So what he's saying is, listen, wives, submit to your husbands, love them in a way that models who Jesus is, shows them who Jesus is, so that there's even a willingness to serve and even to suffer, just as Jesus did for us. Understanding that sort of context helps us then to better understand what is somewhat of an otherwise obscure reference to Sarah, the wife of Abraham, in verses 5 through 6. Let me read these verses for you, then I'll explain what's going on here. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Okay, so here he's upholding Sarah as a model wife who submitted to the authority of her husband Abraham. Now, what's curious about that is that if you actually read the stories of Abraham and Sarah, what you discover is that, actually, Abraham is remarkably less patriarchal than you would expect. Right? That actually, more often than not, it seems like it's Abraham doing what Sarah tells him to do. Right? Sarah tells Abraham to sleep with her maidservant Hagar. Sarah tells Abraham to send her away. Right? He's always doing what she wants her to do. It's actually interesting, right? Because Abraham is like the quintessential patriarch of patriarchalism in the Old Testament, and yet he's remarkably not patriarchal. This was apparently a source of embarrassment to first century Jews who were trying to show Romans that Judaism would fit in well with their culture. You find Josephus and Philo, who were two Jewish writers in the first century, and they wanted Romans to embrace Judaism, and they wanted to show the Romans that the Old Testament narratives were patriarchal just like Romans. They're just as patriarchal as you. And we find in the writings of Josephus and Philo that they're a little embarrassed by some of Abraham's less than patriarchal behaviors and attitudes. So it does seem like most of the time he's not very patriarchal. But there is one instance, sort of famous instance, where he does indeed tell Sarah to do something, and she submits to that. And that's where, and this is where we don't know exactly, he doesn't say exactly what he has in mind, but many scholars think probably what Peter has in mind is this particular episode where they find themselves, Sarah and Abraham, facing a famine, and they have to go into Egypt. And as they're going into Egypt, if you remember the story, Abraham gets a little bit nervous because Sarah is very beautiful. And he's very nervous that when they go into Egypt, that somebody authoritative is going to see her and want to take her as their own wife. And so they're just going to kill Abraham. They're like, if we go in there and they find out I'm here, they're going to kill me so they can take you as their wife. So why don't you just say that you're my sister? Right? He gets really manly and just says, oh no, you just say you're my sister. Don't say you're my husband, right? And what does she do? She agrees. So she's willing to suffer, you get this? She's willing to suffer in order to save his life. And so it seems that many of the first century writers, you see, New Testament writers, as they had come to understand the love of Jesus, they went back and they looked at the Old Testament through a totally different lens. And they started looking for and seeing examples of ways in which particular individuals anticipated the kind of example that Jesus would ultimately have. So it seems that Peter probably has Sarah in mind when he mentions this. So here we see this idea then. So he holds her up as a woman who is willing to suffer and to serve in order to benefit her husband. So we see this principle. But here's the thing, right? What we also need to realize is that men, we are called to the same thing. We see this in the book of Ephesians, where the Apostle Paul addresses marriage as well. Let me read for you here a famous passage. I actually literally just did a wedding yesterday, and then I'm doing a wedding on Friday. So I'm all fired up now. I got this going. We just looked at this passage yesterday. Here we go. Ephesians 5:22 through 25. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Okay, there it is. They're saying the same thing, more or less, that Peter says, wives, submit to your husbands. But then at the wedding yesterday, I looked at the groom-to-be, and I said, I read that, and I said, that looks like a pretty sweet arrangement, doesn't it? And then I said, but guess what? It means the very opposite of what it looks like on the surface. Because if you read one verse later, look what it says here. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. You see this? Here there's a complete redefinition of what it means to lead. Complete redefinition of what it means to be the head of the household. Tim Keller summarizes what this might look like practically in a modern marriage. But how does this authority work out in the context of mutually serving persons, equal in dignity and being? The answer is that the head can only overrule his spouse if he is sure that her choice would be destructive to her or to the family. He does not use his headship selfishly to get his own way about the color of the car they buy, who gets to hold the remote control, and whether he has a night out with the boys or stays home to help with the kids when his wife asks him. You see, this headship, this leadership is actually servant leadership. It turns it completely on its head. And of course, we see this, we see even a hint of this in this passage in 1 Peter. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. Just that. I think, husbands, we could go a long way just by seeking to understand where our wife is coming, just to listen to where she is coming from. So we see then that in this mutual submission, wives to their husbands and husbands to their wives in servant leadership, what do? We are mediating the presence of God to each other within the context of marriage, right? And so here's where we see that the idea of Christian marriage is very different from what you often see elsewhere, right? The reality is that I would say that most people, if you'd ask them about marriage, say, well, why do you want to get married? And you're like, well, I want companionship. Yeah, I want companionship, right? And pleasure. It'll be fun. I want to meet somebody that I like being with, right? So it's about pleasure and it's about companionship. Now, what I would suggest about that is that that's not unbiblical, right? It's not unbiblical to want to find a companion and to enjoy one another in that marriage. Genesis 2 says it is not good for man to be alone, right? There's this idea of companionship being central. The book of Song of Songs is all about enjoying your spouse, the pleasure of intimacy with your spouse. So those reasons are not unbiblical. I would just suggest that they alone are sub-biblical, that they need to be placed within a much broader context. And what we discover, okay, is that the primary purpose for marriage, Christian marriage, is simply this. It is the primary place, where you are called to mediate the presence of God. Right? We've been looking at this for several weeks. Where you mediate your presence of God in the workplace, mediate the presence of God to your neighbors. But when you get married, the primary place where you do that is within your marriage. Right? It's actually important to note here, okay, that this whole passage here is not about marriage. Peter didn't set out to be like, okay, how can I help these people to have a great marriage? No, what it is we got to go back. We went back earlier in the letter when he talks about mediating the presence of God, and then he's just going through and showing what this looks like in different circumstances, including marriage. In other words, I would honestly just say this. If you find yourself saying, man, what can I do to have a great marriage? What can the Bible do to help me have a great marriage? I would already say you're coming off on the wrong foot, if that's the question you're asking. The question we should be asking is not, what can I do to have a great marriage? The question we should be asking is, how can I mediate the presence of God better in my marriage? You see this? It's a complete shift in focus. In fact, this is probably why the Apostle Paul seems pretty ambivalent about marriage in the first place. He's like, honestly, I wish more of you wouldn't get married. I wish you were more like me. But if you're going to get married, well, then here's what you need to do. Why is he kind of ambivalent about that? Because he realizes that actually there's a much greater calling. And that is that no matter what your station is in life, you're called to represent Christ, to mediate the presence of God. And then if you are married, then that becomes the primary context in which you do that. So then Peter goes on and he unpacks a little more. What does this look like to mediate the presence of God within your marriage as a wife, as a husband? And I would suggest that we see this kind of working its way out in two ways. Wives are called to mediate the Christ-like presence of God through their strange beauty, and husbands are called to mediate the presence of God through their strange strength. So first, wives are called to mediate the presence of God through their strange beauty. Okay, we see this here in beginning verse 3. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Now, again, we need to remember the context here. It seems that Peter is addressing a large number of women who are Christian, but their husbands aren't. Their husbands aren't even there. And the context is, how can you mediate the presence of God? And so the point here is, let me just start by saying this. External beauty is not wrong. It's not wrong to braid your hair. It's not wrong to try to look nice, to look good, and even to be attractive to your husband. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, the book of Song of Songs talks about the beauty of physical attraction. So there's nothing wrong in it of itself. Okay, but here's the point: is that you being externally beautiful, okay, is not going to draw your husband into a relationship with Jesus. You see this? I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. It's fine, but it's not going to draw them into a relationship with Jesus. Here's where we need to kind of back up and look at some bigger theological concepts about how God reveals himself to us. Okay, God reveals himself through what we might call general revelation, and then he also reveals himself through what we might call special revelation. Okay, general revelation is he reveals himself through the created order. So he reveals himself through creation. But then he also reveals himself through special revelation. Ultimately, he reveals himself through Jesus, who is the ultimate revelation, and that is to which the scriptures point to. So that's different. Now, here's the point. Somebody might come to believe in God just through general revelation. They might come to, not be an atheist because they see the beauty of creation, right? So another way. So your husband might come to believe in God because he thinks you're really beautiful. Right? I can see that. To be like, boy, man, I didn't believe in God until I met her, and whoo! I'm like, she is not the result of random selection. I'm telling you, that is some, right? I mean, I can see that. So they're just so beautiful that, okay, there's got to be a God. Okay, but they're not going to follow Jesus because you are so physically beautiful. What leads a man to surrender his life to God isn't a beautiful sunset, a beautiful car, a beautiful song, or even a beautiful woman. It is the strange beauty of the cross, the strange beauty of the sacrificial love of God that leads men to follow him. Now, nobody followed Jesus because their wife was a hottie. Nothing wrong with being a hottie. But that's not going to lead them to follow Jesus. But what's going to lead them to follow Jesus is the way in which you model who Jesus is. You live sacrificially, you serve. And in doing that, that draws them not just to believe in God, but to actually follow Jesus. So this strange beauty then, I would say, kind of emerges in three ways in this passage here. First of all, I'll just say purity, reverence, and then a quiet, gentle spirit. First of all, we see this strange beauty, the strange beauty of purity. We see this in verse 1. They may be won, right, talking about winning the husband over to the Lord. They may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct. Right? Here, I would suggest that when it's talking about purity, it's talking about the devotion of a wife. That the husband sees, right, that this individual is truly devoted to, that their wife is devoted to them. And this actually might explain a little bit why he then tells them to not get all decked out with jewelry and whatnot. Because imagine, again, the context here. You have a bunch of women who've converted to Christianity, and now they're coming to church without their husbands, which was already a little suspect in the Roman Empire. But it seems like many of them were getting all decked out for church, right? They're getting all dressed up with their jewelry, and then they're coming to church without their husbands. And Peter's like, what do you think your husbands are thinking of this? Now, you're coming to church, dressing up for church like a hottie, and your husband's already nervous about you going to this weird Christian gathering. What is he going to think's going on in these gatherings if you're dressing up like a hottie? So it's saying it's suggesting that maybe you need to do things that are going to show that you are devoted to him. Strange beauty is seen in the strange purity. Also, reverence talks about respectful conduct. Here, I think what it's pointing to, I remember I was on staff of a church that had multiple staff members. This is a number of years ago. And we had a policy or kind of a principle where we would never criticize each other publicly. Right? If we had issues, we would talk about it with each other, but we wouldn't criticize another staff member publicly. And I would suggest that this is probably in part what he has in mind. Right? Don't go around criticizing your husband publicly. That doesn't show respect for him. Now, the same as saying that you should keep all issues under wraps. It's not saying you go hush-hush with the issues that might be going on in your relationship. There's a place for accountability. There's a place for a community of close people to you that you can share what's going on. Right? It's not saying you shouldn't do that. It's just saying don't go around telling everybody what a lame-o husband you have. Right? Show reverence. So purity, reverence, and then thirdly, this strange beauty is modeled through a quiet and gentle spirit. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Notice here, it's not saying here that the woman needs to be quiet, like she needs to not speak. It's saying that her spirit should be quiet and gentle. And here's what I would just say is that just as you don't go out just criticizing your husband publicly, even in private, you don't just play whack-a-mole with every mistake your husband makes, right? You remember that game Whack-A-Mole where you got the little hammer and you're just waiting for a mole to pop out of the hole, and as soon as it pops up, bam! And then you just keep looking, and then the next one pops up, bam! Right? You remember that? Say, don't every time your husband does something annoying, bam! It doesn't mean that you don't voice your concerns. You just aren't, a quote, quarrelsome wife. Always highlighting their faults in every situation. So what Peter's saying is that when you live this way, with this purity, with this respect, with this quiet and gentle spirit, what you're doing is you're mediating the presence of God to them in a way that may very well draw them into the presence of the Lord in seeing who Jesus really is. Okay, so Peter marks out the strange beauty of a woman who mediates the presence of God to her husband. And then in verse 7, we see the same for the husband. And here we see the strange strength of a husband mediating the presence of God to his wife. Look here in verse 7. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman. Notice the word here, likewise. Right? He's tying this in with what he just said to the wives. So here's what you need to understand, man. Everything he just said to the wife, you need to take that into account too. That's for you too. You need to show that your purity, that you are devoted to her, and you don't act in ways that might call that devotion into question. You are respectful, not criticizing her in public. You're not playing whack-a-mole with everything that you don't like that she's doing. So I would say, he's not just going to repeat himself. So he's taking that, and then he's moving on, and he's saying this again. So then he goes on and talks about this showing honor to the woman. And what I would suggest here is when he talks about showing honor to the woman, again, we've already talked about this, but this is really, really significant within the Roman society and the patriarchalism of the Roman world. Because in Roman society, what it meant to be a strong man was to be one who received praise and honor. That was the mark of a strong man. The mark of a strong man was a man who got other people to do what he wanted to do and then was praised for his strength. Right? I mean, think about this. The model Roman was Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar, that's what a man looks like. A man who goes out and conquers the whole world, puts everybody into subjection, gets everybody to do what he wants to do, and then they praise him and they honor him. In fact, when he died, they said he was a god. Right? That's Roman strength. Is receiving honor. And Peter's saying, you know what? A man's strength is the total opposite. A man does not seek to receive honor, he honors his wife. The strong man doesn't demand his wife's respect. The strong man honors his wife. Completely turns it on its head. Man, we got to really think about what it means to be a strong man. And we need to see it's not about receiving honor from our spouse. It's about giving honor to her. Friends, this is truly different. This is what Jesus calls us to. This is what the message of Easter is all about. On the cross, Jesus died. Jesus suffered. Jesus was humiliated. He gave up all honor for the sake of those whom he loved. And husbands, we lead in that respect, and wives follow as well. Right? This is a very different view of marriage. In the end, we can just say this. Marriage is not about what you get. It's about what you give. And when we live in that way, we mediate the presence of God and show the world something very different. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Communion is an opportunity for us to experience the love of God who gave up all honor on the cross, who loved us, who gave of himself so completely that we can be filled through turning to him, and then through receiving his love, now we are empowered to do the same in whatever context we happen to be living, but especially in the context